And I formed with 6 others the very first student fraternity in the whole of Nigeria.
A secret death cult is thriving in Nigeria, more terrifying than anything I've ever seen.
Other activities have included fighting drug abuse, drug proliferation in the community,
Robbing, raping, and murdering.
There has been a lot of distortion of the original ideals of this student fraternity.
You just play by the rule because these are people who love killing.
What you just heard were clips from 2 different videos. One is a video of Professor Wole Soyinka testifying during the Oputa panel in 2001. That was over 20 years ago. And the other is a BBC documentary released about 2 months ago on the Black Axe, one of the most powerful organized criminal groups based in Nigeria. Now, there is a historical connection between the events discussed in these 2 videos, and Alex and Lucky are here to take you through how the confraternity movement of the 1950s degenerated into the university cults of the 1980s and giving rise to the street gangs of today.
This story is really a story about inclusion and exclusion, and it started back in 1952.
And I formed with 6 others the very first student fraternity in the whole of Nigeria, possibly.
And that confraternity was called the Pirates, also known as the National Association of Sea Dogs.
1952 was 8 years before Nigeria's independence, and it was a time when so much political activism was happening in the country.
By 1952, there were already several political associations that had formed. For example, in 1931, there was the Nigeria Union of Teachers, formed by Oludotun Ransom Kuti, that's Fela Kuti's dad. And even 2 years before then, in 1929, there was the Aba Women's Rebellion. This was when market women in the Southeast organized and successfully rose up against British taxation on women. Years later, in 1945, there was a countrywide general strike that happened, and this involved over 200,000 plus workers and 17 labor unions across Nigeria. This was the first kind of strike of that magnitude, and they were protesting for increased minimum wage. Around all of that political activism, more political associations started to form.
Now, each of these associations had their own ideologies, policies, and missions. But what seemed to unite all of them was a general anti-colonial sentiment and a pro-nationalistic worldview. So, when Wole Soyinka and his friends formed the Pirates Confraternity in 1952, they were also guided by the same sentiments of anti-colonialism and pro-nationalism. But they also had 2 additional very strong sentiments. 1, they wanted to be anti-convention, and 2, they wanted their new group to transcend, to go beyond all forms of ethnic and religious affiliations.
To cut ties with religious and ethnic affiliations, the 7 young men, known as the G7, who formed the Pirates, designed the society using themes from the popular children's book Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson.
At that time, the Pirates Creed required members to pledge against all foreign conventions. And in fact, as part of that, the young men abandoned classical colonial dress of the 3-piece suits, like the jackets, the vests, the ties, and they wore actual pirate outfits, complete with bandanas and cutlasses.
Their logo was the skull and crossbones, and to complete their transformation, they even took on pirate names. Their leader, Wole Soyinka, who was only 18 years old at the time, was known as Captain Blood.
The pirates wanted to be different, and at that time, they were different.
But underneath all the theatrics, the pirates had very specific values. They were anti-colonial, anti-convention, anti-socio-economic class. They were de-tribalized, non-religious, and non-political. They were also non-violent. So the pirates, they had these very lofty and noble goals, which meant that they needed certain types of members. Pirates were clean-cut young men, very intelligent and politically conscious individuals, the cream of the crop.
And for almost 20 years, the pirates were the only fraternity in town. But then, in the late 1960s, just as Nigeria's unity was beginning to fragment, so too were the pirates. The pirates' high academic standards and strict code of conduct for their members meant that over time, a lot of people were either excluded or even kicked out of the group. And of course, naturally, these people, the so-called rejects, went ahead and formed their own associations.
The founders of these other groups, you will find, and check from the record, were usually either those who'd been rejected by the Pirates Confraternity, their conduct simply did not qualify them, or else had been kicked out of the fraternity, or else simply wanted to set up similar associations on their own along certain very warped notions of what fraternities are about.
Part of the core identity of these rival groups is their absolute dislike for what they perceived as snobbery and elitist behavior. So when these rival groups formed, they had to be the very opposite of the elite.
In 1972, a rival fraternity, the Buccaneers, formed as a splinter group from the Pirates. Around the same time, another splinter group called the Eye formed also in the University of Ibadan. And from 1972, fraternities went viral across several universities, mostly in southern Nigeria. And just like viruses, each fraternity had a different set of mutations that made it evolve further and further away from the original.
First of all, remember the original confraternity, the Pirates. They stood against all conventions. And at that time in the 50s, these conventions were British conventions. So it was all fun and games when the students were standing up to the British while wearing pirate costumes.
But then after independence, Nigeria kept a lot of those conventions, which eventually became our laws. So after 1960, when the pirates pledged to stand against all conventions, they were essentially opposing Nigeria's conventions and Nigeria's laws.
Now, take that mutation, the one that required all confraternities to stand against all convention, and add it to the economic crisis of the 1980s. What do you get? Outright criminal behavior.
The global recession of the 1980s hit Nigeria hard, and we were not prepared. In the 1970s, we had invested all this money into university infrastructure, and federal universities were completely free. So everybody went to uni. But by the 80s, even when we couldn't afford to sustain the universities, we kept admitting more and more students.
So in the 80s, we had overcrowded and underfunded universities with young people who had a lot of free time on their hands. And it's in this setting that we had groups of young men who had decided they too were anti-establishment, anti-convention, anti-religion, anti-tribalism, and they were also anti-elitist. So this was basically a classic Lord of the Flies setup.
Now, even though the young men had abandoned all forms of conventions, they still needed to find a way to govern themselves. They still needed something they could rally around as a common belief or a common goal. So they turned to the spirit world.
Worship Kurufu, the unseen God, and Kurufu has always guided us.
Spiritualism, or the belief in the spirit realm, was and is still very much part of the African culture, both here in Africa and amongst African descendants. In Nigeria, our population is split evenly between Christians and Muslims, but still you'll find that, the belief in the spiritual realm exists alongside these two faiths.
There's a whole history of how the British missionaries attempted to eradicate this system of belief, which persisted in the southern part of the country. But they only really succeeded in pushing it underground. They didn't completely eliminate it.
So, in their zeal to go against convention, the young men co-opted the ancient system of spiritualism, and they went on to corrupt that system in order to serve their own purposes. See, when they did this, they lost their identities as confraternities and they became cults. They began to operate under very high levels of secrecy, which allowed them to form criminal networks consisting of very fierce and very loyal members. And their only goal became to sustain their own existence. They had no greater goal other than themselves.
By 1979, New cults began forming with clear criminal intents, and their new names even reflected this new orientation. There was the campus mafia of 1979, formed at the University of Ile-Ife. The Klansmen confraternity was formed in 1983 at the University of Calabar. Over in Port Harcourt, the Supreme Vikings formed in 1984. That was the same year that Wole Soyinka was forced to shut down all pirate confraternity activities on campus due to the increase in violence.
In the early days, the violence started with offering protection to members or assistance in the form of intimidation to those who had their girlfriends stolen by non-members. They would also pay off professors and lecturers, or they would intimidate them into giving members good grades in class.
But by 1991, the violence escalated into downright murder. The first case of cult beheading that we know of happened in 1991 at the University of Port Harcourt during a feud between two rival cults.
Fast forward 30 years to today, and Nigeria is still dealing with cult-related violence. The violence is very much part of the universities now, but it has spread beyond university walls and is terrifying local communities. According to data from the Council on Foreign Relations, from 2016 to the end of 2020, the newspapers have reported over 370 incidents involving cults. 80% of these incidents occurred in just 10 states: Rivers, Lagos, Edo, Delta, Bayelsa, Cross River, Akwa Ibom, Benue, Ondo, and Ogun states.
In that same time period from 2016 to 2020, cult violence has taken over 1,000 lives, and in the most brutal of ways. And what's even scarier now is that we are seeing young boys as young as 14 years old being recruited into these cults. You're probably wondering, in all of this, where are the grown-ups?
In June of 2020, the BBC did a report on Nigeria's campus cults, and they interviewed Professor Wole Soyinka. In that interview, he said, and I quote, "I never imagined that any university-based group could actually adopt a mafia style, which involved manhood tests like raping, robbery, arms, murder, kidnapping. At no time did I imagine that anything could degenerate." At the time he formed the Pirates, Wole Soyinka was only 18 years old. Of course, he wasn't going to imagine that the idea of confraternities would degenerate. His imagination didn't go past wearing a pirate hat and going around saying, "Ahoy, matey." It wasn't his job to imagine the consequences. I mean, that's what the adults around him should have been doing. So where were they back then? And where are they today?
Hey everyone, what we brought to you in this episode was a very brief summary of events, the very, very tip of a very large iceberg. Now we can spend hours discussing all the factors that have contributed to the disintegration of confraternities into cults, and like everyone else, we can point fingers at just about everything. We can point at government, parents, teachers, etc., etc. And I do think it's really important for us to understand all of those factors, but there's one particular factor that I want to focus on at this moment, and that's the exclusivity factor. Now, every human being wants to feel important, and part of our feeling of importance comes from participating in a group. A mature society recognizes this basic human need and tries to create an environment where different groups can thrive, so that every person feels that they are participating in something. What happened with the Pirates Confraternity is an example of a violation of this basic fundamental need. A group was created for a certain type of person, a certain type of mold, and if you didn't fit it, then you were out. And for nearly 20 years, there was no other option. A system like this, that excludes and does not offer other options, is bound to fail. And it's bound to fail because of another basic principle. Life is a numbers game. When you have exclusivity, it means that you have drawn a circle around yourself and your group. Now, your group may be just 7 people, it could be 700, 7,000, or even 7 million. The point is, when you decide to draw a circle around your group, keep in mind that the number of people outside of that circle is 7-fold. 7 times over. So eventually they will break through your circle because they outnumber you and your group. So you have one of two options. You can keep fighting for exclusivity down to the last man, or you can expand the circle to include as many people as possible. You grow the group. Which brings me back to Alex's question. Where were the grown-ups back in the days when 18-year-old Wole Soyinka formed the Pirates Confraternity? Well, they were busy fighting their way into exclusive groups. So it made sense for Soyinka and his peers to set up the same type of system in their own university world. They set up an exclusive circle. But Soyinka and his peers at that moment did not know that life is a numbers game. And there were so many more of those people outside of the circle than there were in the circle. It only makes sense that all the people who they left out of the circle broke through the circle and have reduced the confraternity concept into absolute chaos. So what do we do now? Well, that's left to the grown-ups. We, the grown-ups, can continue fighting to be part of exclusive circles, or we can start to understand that it's much more important, much more sustainable to grow the circle, make it bigger. When the grown-ups start to understand that it's more important to have a small piece of a big circle than a big piece of a small circle, the young ones will follow suit. The Backstory is a Triple E Media production. Production copyright 2022 Triple E Media Productions. If you enjoyed this episode of The Backstory and you would like to hear more, go to our website at 234audio.com to play the sample content. Then download our app from the Google Play Store for even more episodes. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at 234audio to watch the video for this episode. Make sure to click the notification bell, like, and leave a comment. Our episodes can also be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment because it helps other people find our content. This episode of The Backstory was produced by Ramat Mohammed, Usama Lucky, Alexandra Gekpe, Uche Mba, Sam Tabakaji, and Dominic Tabakaji. Executive producer Ramat Mohammed. Special thanks to Mala Iwa Badu Ikaleku.